Michael Jackson bought Neverland Ranch in 1987 for $19.5 million. When he died 22 years later, the property had become so toxic, legally, financially, and reputationally, that no one would touch it. Not at $50 million. Not at 30. Not even at 22. The ranch that was supposed to be a private paradise became a crime scene in the public imagination, a financial sinkhole in reality, and a perfect example of how a property can be destroyed not by neglect, but by the exact thing that made it famous. Its owner's identity fused so completely with the land that when the identity collapsed, the land became worthless. By the time Jackson died in 2009, Neverland hadn't functioned as his home for 5 years. He had abandoned it in 2005, immediately after being acquitted of child molestation charges in a trial that had turned the ranch into a globally recognized symbol of alleged abuse. The property sat empty, accruing costs but generating nothing. And when Jackson's estate was finally assessed, the executors discovered that Neverland wasn't just worthless, it was worse than worthless. It was a liability actively destroying the estate's value, and no legal or financial maneuver could change that without confronting the one thing no one wanted to say out loud: Michael Jackson's most famous asset had become evidence of his most damaging accusations. If you're still watching, you're about to learn how a property can die while its owner is still alive, and how death doesn't fix the problem, it just transfers it. Jackson had purchased the 2,700-acre ranch in California's Santa Ynez Valley with a vision. It would be a private wonderland, a place where he could reclaim the childhood he never had. He installed amusement park rides, a Ferris wheel, a carousel, a roller coaster. He built a private zoo with elephants, giraffes, and exotic birds. He constructed a 40-seat movie theater, a railway station with a working train, and a floral clock made from thousands of living plants. The ranch had its own fire department, its own power generation system, and a full-time staff of over 150 people. The operating costs were staggering, estimated at $5 million per year just for basic maintenance, staff salaries, animal care, and utilities. But Neverland wasn't a business. It was a manifestation of Jackson's psychology, built without regard for return on investment, operational sustainability, or exit strategy. And that meant when Jackson's income collapsed, the ranch became an anchor dragging him toward bankruptcy. By the early 2000s, Jackson's financial situation was catastrophic. His album sales had declined. His spending had not. He was borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars, using his music catalog, including his stake in the Beatles' publishing rights, as collateral. The loans were structured with balloon payments, adjustable interest rates, and covenants that required Jackson to maintain certain asset values. Neverland was listed as a major asset in those loan agreements, appraised at over $50 million. But the appraisal was based on comparable luxury estates, not on Neverland's actual marketability. The property was a custom-built fantasy compound in a rural area with limited infrastructure, no commercial zoning, and a layout that served no practical residential purpose. Who would buy a house with amusement park rides rusting in the backyard? The appraisal was fiction, and everyone in the financial chain knew it. But the fiction was necessary to justify the loans. Then came the 2005 trial. Jackson was accused of molesting a 13-year-old boy at Neverland. The trial lasted 5 months. The prosecution presented Neverland as the scene of the crime, a place specifically designed to lure children, isolate them, and normalize inappropriate contact. They described the ranch's layout, the amusement park to attract children, the zoo to extend their visits, the alarm system outside Jackson's bedroom to alert him if anyone approached. Whether the allegations were true or false became almost irrelevant to Neverland's market value. The property had been narrated into existence as a predator's lair on global television. That narrative couldn't be undone by a not guilty verdict. Jackson was acquitted on all counts. But Neverland was convicted in the court of public perception, and real estate value is determined by perception, not verdicts. Jackson never returned to the ranch. He left the United States entirely, spending years in Bahrain, Ireland, and Las Vegas. Neverland's staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. The animals were relocated to zoos and sanctuaries. The amusement park rides were shut down and left to decay. The property fell into disrepair, not catastrophic neglect, but the kind of slow entropy that happens when a place built for constant activity is suddenly abandoned. Paint peeled. Mechanical systems failed. Landscaping overgrew. The ranch was still legally owned by Jackson, still listed as a major asset, still used as collateral for loans, but it was functionally dead. If you're realizing that the property's value existed only as long as Jackson's public image held, you're understanding how celebrity real estate actually works. The loan payments on Neverland became untenable. Jackson had borrowed against the property, and when he stopped making payments, the lenders moved to foreclose. In 2008, 1 year before his death, Neverland was scheduled for auction. Jackson's financial advisors scrambled to refinance. They brought in Colony Capital, a private equity firm specializing in distressed assets. Colony purchased the note, the debt Jackson owed, for approximately $23 million, which effectively gave them control of the property. Jackson retained a minority stake, but he no longer controlled Neverland. The deal saved the ranch from public auction, but it also formalized what had been true for years: Jackson didn't really own Neverland anymore. He owned a piece of a distressed asset controlled by a firm whose only interest was recovering their investment. This is how wealth evaporates in real time, not through dramatic loss, but through quiet restructurings that convert ownership into optionality, and optionality into nothing. When Jackson died in June 2009, the executors of his estate, John Branca and John McLean, faced an immediate problem. The estate was over $400 million in debt. Jackson's assets included his music catalog, his stake in Sony/ATV Publishing, his image rights, and his real estate holdings. But most of those assets were encumbered, pledged as collateral, tangled in legal disputes, or structured in ways that made liquidation difficult. Neverland was the most visible asset and the most problematic. It was worth tens of millions of dollars on paper, but it couldn't be sold without addressing its reputational toxicity. And it was costing the estate hundreds of thousands of dollars per year just to maintain minimal security and groundskeeping. The executors couldn't sell it. They couldn't develop it. They couldn't even donate it. No charity wanted the liability. So the property sat, legally frozen, financially hemorrhaging, and symbolically radioactive. Colony Capital, which controlled the majority stake, tried to find a buyer. They listed Neverland for $100 million in 2015. The listing described the property as a pristine estate with world-class amenities. It made no mention of Michael Jackson. The marketing materials referred to it as Sycamore Valley Ranch, the property's original name before Jackson bought it. The strategy was clear: erase Jackson, erase the trial, and sell it as a generic luxury estate. But the strategy failed because the erasure was incomplete. Everyone knew it was Neverland. The address was public. The photos showed the distinctive gates, the train station, the floral clock. You couldn't sell Neverland by pretending it wasn't Neverland. The property received no serious offers. The listing price was dropped to $67 million. Still nothing. It was dropped again to $31 million. A few buyers toured the property, but none made offers. The problem wasn't the price, it was the product. Neverland had no viable use case. It was too large for a private residence. It was too remote for a hotel or resort. It couldn't be converted into a museum or attraction because the zoning didn't allow it, and the neighbors would fight any commercial development. And no wealthy buyer wanted to live in a house that would forever be associated with child abuse allegations, regardless of the trial's outcome. If you're still here, it's because you're seeing the structural trap. The property's fame makes it unsellable, but obscuring the fame makes it unrecognizable, and unrecognizable luxury estates in rural California don't sell for tens of millions. The carrying costs were destroying the estate's finances. Property taxes on Neverland were over $400,000 per year. Insurance was astronomical. The property had unique risks due to its infrastructure, and no standard homeowner's policy would cover it. Security was necessary to prevent trespassing, vandalism, and tabloid photographers from sneaking onto the grounds. Groundskeeping was required to prevent the property from becoming a fire hazard. California vegetation overgrowth is a liability in wildfire zones. The estate was spending over $1 million per year to maintain a property that generated zero revenue and had no plausible path to sale. Meanwhile, the amusement park rides were decaying into genuine hazards. The Ferris wheel structure was rusting. The roller coaster tracks were warping. The carousel's mechanical systems were seizing. These weren't just aesthetic problems, they were liability issues. If someone broke onto the property and was injured by the equipment, the estate could be sued. But dismantling the rides was expensive and would erase the few remaining features that gave Neverland any identity. The estate was caught between preserving a toxic asset and paying to destroy what little value remained. The executors considered several options. One was to donate Neverland to a non-profit that would convert it into a camp for sick children, the ultimate reputational rehabilitation. But the operational costs made it impossible. No charity could afford $5 million per year in operating expenses. Another option was to sell it at a massive loss just to eliminate the liability. But selling below the loan value would require Colony capital to accept a loss, and Colony had no interest in losing money to solve the estate's public relations problem. A third option was to let it decay until it became worthless, then walk away. But abandoning Neverland would trigger foreclosure, which would damage the estate's credit and its ability to negotiate other deals. Every option was bad. The question was which bad option was least catastrophic. In 2019, Neverland finally sold. The buyer was Ron Burkle, a billionaire investor and former business associate of Jackson's. The price was $22 million, less than Jackson had paid for it 32 years earlier, and far below the appraised value that had been used to justify loans for over a decade. Burkle's purchase was widely described as a favor to the Jackson estate, a way to remove a financial albatross while giving the property to someone who wouldn't exploit it for tabloid value. Burkle stated publicly that he had no plans to change the property or open it to the public. He would maintain it as a private residence. But even that sale didn't resolve the estate's problems. The $22 million price barely covered the outstanding debt on the property. After paying off Colony capital and covering the transaction costs, the estate netted almost nothing. Neverland had consumed millions in carrying costs over 10 years and generated zero return. It had been a financial black hole that the estate finally escaped, not by selling at a profit, but by selling at a loss small enough to be absorbed. This is the hidden math of legacy real estate. The goal isn't profit, it's damage control. And damage control is just a slower form of loss. But the story doesn't end with the sale, because Neverland's toxicity wasn't confined to the property, it had infected Jackson's entire estate strategy. The executors had rebuilt Jackson's financial empire after his death through a series of brilliant moves. They refinanced his debts, renegotiated his recording contracts, licensed his music for films and commercials, and produced the This Is It documentary, which grossed over $260 million. By 2016, the estate had generated over $2 billion in revenue. Jackson earned more in death than he had in the final decade of his life. But every financial success was shadowed by Neverland's reputational damage. In 2013, choreographer Wade Robson filed a lawsuit alleging that Jackson had sexually abused him at Neverland as a child. In 2014, another lawsuit was filed by James Safechuck with similar allegations. Both cases were eventually dismissed on technical grounds. The statute of limitations had expired, but the allegations were detailed, public, and damaging. Then in 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland aired on HBO. It featured extensive interviews with Robson and Safechuck describing years of alleged abuse at the ranch. The documentary was watched by millions and reignited global debate about Jackson's legacy. The estate sued HBO for breach of contract, claiming the documentary violated a non-disparagement clause from a 1992 concert deal. The case dragged on for years and was eventually dismissed. But the lawsuit revealed the estate's strategic dilemma. They couldn't defend Jackson without drawing more attention to the allegations, but ignoring the allegations allowed the narrative to harden into accepted fact. Neverland had become the geographic center of a story the estate couldn't control and couldn't escape. The ranch's ongoing symbolic toxicity affected licensing deals, merchandising partnerships, and even the management of Jackson's music catalog. Radio stations reduced airplay of Jackson's songs after Leaving Neverland aired. Streaming numbers dropped. The estate's revenue declined for the first time since Jackson's death. Corporate partners became nervous. Brands didn't want to be associated with allegations of child abuse, even if those allegations were unproven. The estate found itself in the impossible position of managing a billion-dollar brand that was one documentary away from collapse at any moment. If you've watched this far, you're understanding that Neverland's failure wasn't about bad property management, it was about the impossibility of separating a place from the story told about it, and the impossibility of monetizing a legacy when the story is contested. The Jackson family's relationship with Neverland became another source of conflict. Some family members wanted the property preserved as a memorial. Others wanted it demolished to eliminate the association with the allegations. Jackson's mother, Catherine, reportedly never wanted to visit the property. She saw it as the source of her son's legal and reputational destruction. Jackson's children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, had mixed feelings. They had memories of living there as small children, but those memories were now entangled with public accusations about what had happened to other children on the same grounds. The estate couldn't create a coherent narrative about Neverland because the family itself couldn't agree on what the property meant. Was it a symbol of Jackson's creativity and generosity, or was it evidence of his dysfunction and alleged crimes? The ambiguity made any commercial or memorial use impossible. Ron Burkle, the billionaire who bought Neverland, has kept the property almost entirely private. There are no public tours. No media access. No events. The ranch has effectively been erased from public visibility. Burkle's strategy is the only one that works: remove Neverland from the conversation entirely. Don't defend it, don't explain it, don't monetize it, just make it disappear. The property still exists, but it exists in a kind of witness protection, hidden under its pre-Jackson name, stripped of its amusement park identity, and maintained as an anonymous luxury estate that just happens to occupy the same coordinates as one of the most famous and controversial properties in American history. This is the final stage of toxic asset management, erasure. When a property can't be rehabilitated or sold, the only option is to make it invisible and wait for cultural memory to fade. But cultural memory doesn't fade when new allegations keep emerging. In 2023, new lawsuits were filed against Jackson's estate under California's extended statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse claims. The lawsuits once again centered on alleged abuse at Neverland. The estate once again moved to dismiss on technical grounds. The legal battles continue, and with them, the association between Neverland and the allegations continues to be reinforced in court documents, media coverage, and public consciousness. The executors have done extraordinary work rebuilding Jackson's financial empire, but they've never solved the Neverland problem because the Neverland problem can't be solved. It can only be managed, minimized, and outlasted. The property is gone from the estate's balance sheet, but it remains the symbolic center of every reputational crisis the estate faces. Every documentary, every lawsuit, every anniversary of the trial brings Neverland back into the conversation. And every time Neverland comes back, the estate's value is questioned again. This is the long tale of legacy collapse. The asset can be sold, but the story can't. And in the world of celebrity estates, the story is the asset. The ultimate lesson of Neverland isn't about Michael Jackson's guilt or innocence, it's about the structural impossibility of managing a property whose value was entirely dependent on the owner's image, when that image becomes permanently contested. Graceland survived because Elvis's controversies were personal and faded with time. The Playboy Mansion survived because Hefner's exploitation was culturally accepted for decades before it became controversial. But Neverland couldn't survive because the allegations against Jackson were about children, and those allegations were refreshed repeatedly through lawsuits, documentaries, and investigative journalism. Neverland was built as a fantasy. It died as evidence. And no amount of money, legal maneuvering, or rebranding could change what the property had come to represent. The ranch didn't fail because it was poorly managed. It failed because it succeeded too well at being exactly what Jackson wanted it to be, a perfect physical manifestation of his inner world. And when that inner world was put on trial, the property was convicted along with it. The estate is worth over $2 billion today. But it would be worth more if Neverland had never existed. That's the hidden cost no one calculates, not what the property consumed in cash, but what it consumed in credibility, marketability, and narrative control. Jackson built Neverland to escape the world's judgment. Instead, he built the stage where that judgment would be performed forever. And his heirs are still paying the price.